They attacked a human diplomat, thinking it would be an easy conquest, but they didn't realize death was already beside them. Fascinated by humanity's ultimate victory? Subscribe now to witness more epic HFY stories and legendary battles. The chamber was built for power, not comfort, and every species seated at the long circular table reflected that truth in their own way. Towering frames, armored hides, glowing eyes, and sharp crests filled the room, each delegate wearing symbols of dominance and history. At the far end sat the human, smaller than all of them, dressed in a plain dark suit with no visible armor, no weapons, and no guards standing behind him. His nameplate simply read Earth. Many eyes drifted toward the human again and again, some curious, some amused, some openly dismissive. To most of the council, he looked out of place. Like a scholar who had wandered into a battlefield, his posture was relaxed, his hands folded calmly on the table, his breathing steady. He did not fidget. He did not scan the room nervously. He simply waited. The other diplomats whispered among themselves, believing the human could not hear them. They spoke of how young humanity was, how fragile their colonies were, how their bodies lacked natural armor or claws. Some even wondered aloud how such a species had survived long enough to earn a seat at the table. The human showed no reaction. His face remained neutral, his eyes attentive but soft. When the council session officially began, voices rose quickly. Arguments clashed. Old rivalries surfaced. Threats were wrapped in polite words. The human listened to every exchange without interrupting. While others leaned forward aggressively or slammed limbs against the table, he remained still, like a quiet center in a storm. One delegate finally addressed him directly, their tone sharp with barely hidden contempt, asking why Earth thought it deserved equal standing among ancient powers. The room fell silent, expecting the human to defend himself, to boast or to beg. Instead, he answered calmly. Choosing each word with care, he spoke of cooperation, shared survival, and mutual benefit. His voice was steady, not loud, not weak, just controlled. Some delegates exchanged looks, disappointed. They had expected fire or fear, not reason. To them, his answer confirmed their belief that humans avoided conflict because they could not win it. A few smiled to themselves, already convinced they understood him completely. What they did not notice was how the human absorbed every reaction, every shift in posture, every change in tone. His calm was not ignorance, it was awareness. He noticed which delegates leaned back when power was mentioned, which ones grew tense at the word alliance, which eyes flicked toward him with calculation instead of mockery. He was not silent because he had nothing to say. He was silent because he was listening. Behind the scenes, systems far beyond the chamber were already active, not because of any threat made today, but because that was how humans operated. Precaution was not a response, it was a habit. Treaties had layers, protocols had backups, and every diplomat carried the weight of an entire civilization's preparation. None of this showed on the human's face. To the council, he looked alone, but solitude was an illusion. Every word spoken in that chamber was being recorded, analyzed, and stored. Every gesture measured against past encounters. The human knew this, and it allowed him to sit calmly while others displayed their power openly. As the session moved forward, the human spoke less and less, choosing silence where others chose dominance. His restraint unsettled a few delegates who could not decide whether he was brave or foolish. Those who mistook quiet for weakness felt confident, almost eager. By the end of the meeting, many had dismissed him entirely. Labeling Earth as cautious, harmless, and predictable, the human rose from his seat, nodded respectfully to the council, and exited without ceremony, his footsteps soft against the chamber floor. None of them realized that the quiet human at the table was not the absence of danger, but the presence of control. They had seen his silence and thought it meant safety, unaware that in human culture, silence often came before irreversible decisions. And while they believed they had measured him correctly, the truth was far more dangerous. He had already measured them. The meeting ended, but the thoughts it planted did not fade. Among the many species that left the chamber, one faction felt something close to satisfaction. They believed they had seen the truth behind humanity, a small species hiding behind polite words and fragile diplomacy. To them, the quiet human was proof that Earth lacked real strength. In private halls far from the council floor, members of this faction gathered. Their voices low but confident, they spoke openly of how humans avoided confrontation, how their diplomat had sat unguarded, how no warships had been visible near the station. Arrogance filled the room as they convinced themselves that humanity survived only because no one had bothered to crush them yet. They began to frame their plan not as an attack, but as a lesson, a public humiliation meant to remind the galaxy who truly held power. Harming a human diplomat, they believed, would carry little risk. Earth was too young, too cautious, too dependent on alliances to respond forcefully, or so they assumed. What fed their confidence most was how normal everything seemed after the meeting. No alarms, no warnings, no change in human behavior. The diplomat continued his schedule calmly, moving through the station with the same composed manner. He spoke politely with other delegates, attended cultural briefings, and rested in his assigned quarters. This quiet routine only strengthened the attackers' belief that they were invisible and safe. They mistook preparation for absence. They believed danger always announced itself with noise and threat. They did not understand that humans prepared long before conflict appeared. Their culture had been shaped by history, where survival depended on seeing disaster early, not reacting late. As the hostile faction refined their plan, they carefully avoided actions that would look openly violent. They wanted plausible denial, an incident that could be dismissed as chaos or misunderstanding, perhaps a controlled security failure, perhaps a symbolic act meant to frighten rather than kill. They wanted the human shaken, not dead, a warning carved into memory. What they never considered was how closely they were already being watched. Every unusual movement, every encrypted message, every shift in resource allocation had been quietly flagged. Human systems did not wait for certainty. They worked on probability, and probability was already leaning toward danger. Still, the attackers laughed at the idea of human intelligence being a threat. They imagined slow reaction times, political hesitation, endless debates before action. They had studied human media, human speeches, and human diplomacy, but they had not studied human contingency. The irony was cruel. The more confident they became, the more careless they grew. Small mistakes appeared in their coordination. Patterns formed where secrecy should have been. To them, these details meant nothing. To the silent observers behind the human diplomat, they meant everything. The human himself showed no sign of suspicion. He did not increase his security. He did not change his route. He did not confront anyone. His calm was mistaken for ignorance, when in truth it was discipline. He followed protocol precisely, trusting systems designed long before this meeting ever took place. To the attackers, this was the final proof. If the human knew, he would react. They told themselves. He would run, hide, demand protection. Instead, he continued to act like a guest who believed in the safety of the station, and that belief sealed their decision. They chose their moment carefully, a time when the station would be busy, when attention would be divided, when confusion could be blamed on technical error. They felt powerful knowing they controlled the timing, unaware that timing was already out of their hands. Their arrogance blinded them to the truth that humans rarely reveal fear before action, that silence often means trust in systems rather than ignorance of threat. The mistake they made was not underestimating the human diplomat alone. It was underestimating what stood invisibly behind him. As they finalized their plan, confidence hardened into certainty. They believed they were hunters preparing to strike prey, never realizing that to humans, a diplomat was never bait and never alone. And by the time they moved to act, the mistake born of arrogance had already become irreversible. The moment arrived without warning, just as the attackers had planned. The station moved through its normal cycle of activity. Lights glowed softly, corridors filled with mixed species traffic, and security systems hummed in the background like they always did. Nothing felt different. Nothing looked dangerous. And that was exactly why they chose this time. The human diplomat walked through a public transit corridor, unarmed, unescorted, his expression calm and unreadable. To anyone watching, he appeared relaxed, almost casual, a single figure surrounded by strangers, to the hostile faction hidden among the crowd. This looked like the perfect opening, proof that their assumptions had been correct. The attack began as a small thing, not an explosion, not a public act of war, but a controlled failure. A section of the corridor's security field flickered and dropped, just long enough to create confusion. Alarms did not scream. Lights did not flash red. It felt like a technical glitch, the kind that happened often on old stations. In that instant, the attackers moved. Their steps were fast and coordinated, their weapons designed to incapacitate rather than kill. They wanted the human alive, shaken, humiliated. They wanted witnesses. They wanted the message to spread without forcing the galaxy to respond immediately. What surprised them first was the human's reaction, or rather, the lack of one. He did not run. He did not shout. He did not raise his hands in panic. He simply stopped walking and turned slowly to face them. His posture straight, his breathing even, his eyes steady. This calm unsettled them more than resistance would have. One attacker hesitated, confused by the absence of fear, but momentum carried the plan forward. Restraints activated, weapons locked onto the human's body, and still he did not resist. He did not plead. He did not ask who they were or why they were doing this. He only watched them closely, as if memorizing their faces. Around them, civilians froze, some backed away, others stared in disbelief. The corridor felt suddenly narrow and heavy, tension pressed against every breath. The attackers felt powerful in that moment, convinced that they controlled the situation, that the galaxy would soon see humanity placed in its proper position. Then something subtle changed. It was not visible, not dramatic, but those trained to sense danger might have felt it. The background hum of the station shifted tone. Communication channels hesitated for a fraction of a second. Internal systems began to realign quietly. The human diplomat noticed this change, though he gave no sign. He knew the feeling well. It was the sensation of systems waking up, of processes moving from observation to action. He remained still, trusting what had been built around him long before this day. The attackers mistook his stillness for surrender. They moved closer, speaking in harsh tones, delivering threats meant to echo. They told him to remember this moment, to carry it back to Earth as a warning. They believed they were teaching a lesson. What they did not understand was that the lesson had already begun. Not for the human, but for them. Every second they delayed, every word they spoke gave more time for invisible lines of authority and response to lock into place. The corridor doors sealed silently at both ends, not slamming shut, just closing as if on routine schedule. The attackers barely noticed, focused on their captive. Station security feeds rerouted automatically. External observers lost sight of the incident without realizing it. The human finally spoke, his voice calm, almost gentle. He did not threaten them. He did not demand release. He simply told them that what they were doing would be recorded accurately, completely, and permanently. This confused them. They laughed, believing recordings could be erased or rewritten. They tightened their grip, certain now that victory was theirs, unaware that the moment they crossed from intention to action, control had slipped from their hands. They thought the attack was beginning, but in truth, it had already ended. Because while they believed they were standing beside a helpless human, they failed to see that death was not charging in with weapons drawn. It was already present, patient, quiet, and activated by their own choice to strike. The response did not arrive like a storm. There were no explosions, no shouting orders, no sudden rush of armed forces. Instead, it unfolded with quiet precision, layer by layer, exactly as it had been designed to do, long before the human diplomat ever stepped onto the station. The sealed corridor was only the first sign. Elsewhere in the station, systems adjusted themselves without drawing attention. Security authority quietly shifted. Command access rerouted through protocols marked diplomatic contingency to outside observers. Nothing appeared wrong. The station continued operating normally, but inside its digital core, control was changing hands. Human defense protocols were not built for drama. They were built for certainty. Artificial intelligences that had been dormant moved into active analysis, comparing live data against thousands of possible threat outcomes. Every movement of the attackers was tracked, not just visually, but biologically, emotionally, and strategically. Beyond the station, far from public sensors, human fleets received silent updates, not alarms, not battle calls, just confirmation that a protected asset was under direct threat. Ships adjusted positions subtly, slipping into legal proximity under existing treaties. No weapons powered up, no formations changed aggressively, but lines were drawn. On the station itself, emergency response teams did not rush in. That would have escalated the situation too quickly. Instead, pressure was applied through environment control, gravity adjusted slightly in the sealed corridor, air composition shifted just enough to slow aggressive movement. Nothing harmful, nothing obvious, just enough to tilt balance away from the attackers. They began to feel it before they understood it, a heaviness in their limbs, a delay between thought and motion, irritation rising without clear cause. They blamed nerves, adrenaline, anything but the truth. The human diplomat felt it too, but to him it was familiar. This was the feeling of being inside a controlled zone where chaos was not allowed to grow. His calm deepened, not because he enjoyed the situation, but because he trusted it. Across multiple systems, legal protocols activated alongside security ones. The attackers' identities were confirmed, affiliations traced, previous violations flagged. In real time, their political protection began to erode. Immunity clauses narrowed. Deniability collapsed under data they did not know existed. What made the response terrifying was not its power, but its restraint. Every human system was focused on containment, not punishment, on control, not revenge. Escalation paths were calculated and then deliberately avoided, unless absolutely necessary. The attackers finally sensed something was wrong. Their communication devices lagged, signals took longer to transmit, replies came delayed or distorted. They attempted to pull back to end the incident before it went too far. But even that option was slipping away. Station security finally arrived, not aggressively, not with weapons raised, but calmly, professionally. Their authority unquestioned, their orders clear. The corridor remained sealed. Witnesses were gently redirected. The situation reframed as a security incident under diplomatic jurisdiction. The attackers protested, shouted about authority, about power, about consequences. But their words carried less weight with every passing second. Systems no longer recognized them as dominant actors. They were now variables in someone else's equation. The human diplomat said nothing during this phase. He did not need to. Everything that mattered was already happening. His silence was not passive. It was confirmation that the process was proceeding as intended. Elsewhere, human legal representatives prepared statements that would never sound like threats, only facts, timelines, and responsibilities. The galaxy would not hear about an attack. It would hear about a breach, a failure of protocol, a necessary response. What the attackers never understood was that human diplomats were not protected by guards or weapons. They were protected by systems designed to remove choice from anyone foolish enough to cross certain lines. Once activated, those systems did not care about pride or intent, only outcome. By the time full control of the situation was established, the attackers were no longer aggressors. They were evidence, and the station returned to its gentle hum, lights steady, corridors open, activity flowing again. To outsiders, it would seem like nothing serious had happened. But for those trapped inside the moment, the truth was clear. They had triggered protocols older than fear, protocols that did not rush, did not hesitate, and once awakened, did not forget. The human diplomat remained perfectly still as the attackers realized they no longer controlled the situation. The corridor felt smaller, heavier, as if the walls themselves were pressing down on them. Every action they took was slowed by subtle manipulations they could not see. Systems designed for precision were unfolding quietly, invisibly. He finally spoke, his voice calm and steady, carrying across the sealed corridor without a hint of anger. He did not yell. He did not threaten. He did not insult. He simply stated what had already been set in motion, what was inevitable. He reminded them that their actions had consequences that extended far beyond the immediate moment. The attackers were confused at first. They had expected fear. They had expected pleas. They had expected resistance. Anything but the quiet clarity of a human who knew exactly what would happen. Their confusion made them reckless. Their movements less coordinated, their nerves fraying. The human diplomat did not need to move to defend himself. He did not need to raise his hands. He did not need to react violently. His calm created a mirror of inevitability. The attackers could feel it in every nerve. Every hesitation, every misstep became magnified. Behind him, systems continued to work silently, AI monitoring the environment, analyzing every movement, predicting every possible escape or attack. legal protocols cascading through networks and fleets far beyond the station, every detail checked, verified, and ready to be executed at the precise moment. The attackers realized too late that they had underestimated not only the diplomat, but the entire structure behind him. The quiet human was the center of a web, and the web had already tightened around them. They tried to withdraw, to retreat, but the corridor doors sealed their path. The air subtly shifted, the environment itself resisting their movement. The diplomat spoke again, now pointing out their errors, not with malice, but with certainty, explaining that their attempt would not be seen as a minor incident, that the galaxy would record everything, and that each miscalculation on their part had already been cataloged and would be addressed through precise and unavoidable measures. The attackers grew desperate, shouting at the systems, trying to force them to fail, trying to intimidate the human, but each attempt only confirmed what he had said. Every failure to control the situation reinforced the inescapable truth that they were no longer in charge. Other species, watching from distant consoles or through indirect communication channels, began to whisper among themselves, some in shock, some in awe, seeing the quiet human wield authority without lifting a weapon, without raising his voice, simply by presence and procedure. The diplomat continued calmly, offering choices that were not really choices, options that only seemed flexible, but were in fact guided toward a single outcome. He spoke of law, of consequence, of inevitability. The attackers realized slowly that resistance was meaningless, that the moment they had chosen violence had already sealed their fate. Silence returned between statements, heavy, oppressive, filled with the understanding that the human was not bluffing, that he did not need to act with rage or force to control everything around him. His mere composure and awareness had turned the tide. Every system around him, from environmental controls to fleet positioning to legal and political networks, worked in quiet harmony, all activated by the decision of the human to remain calm. His restraint had become the most powerful weapon in the galaxy, more precise and unavoidable than any missile or laser. The attackers' arrogance was stripped away, replaced by a dawning understanding that patience and discipline were not signs of weakness, but signs of immense strength. They began to comprehend that humans measured consequences with an efficiency that was chilling, and that once engaged, there was no escaping the design they had triggered. By the end of the confrontation, the attackers were exhausted, not physically, but mentally. Every instinct to fight, to resist, to dominate had been anticipated, neutralized, and recorded, leaving them with only the realization that they had been outmaneuvered entirely without a single violent act from the diplomat. He did not gloat, he did not celebrate. He simply turned and walked from the corridor, leaving the attackers to confront the reality of their own mistakes, and leaving a quiet lesson in the minds of all who witnessed it. Calm, calculation, and control were often deadlier than aggression. And patience, when paired with preparation, could accomplish what brute force never could. The attackers were stunned as the full scope of humanity's response became clear. It was not chaos. It was precision. Every action they had taken, every step they had made against the diplomat, had been anticipated, cataloged, and countered in ways they could barely perceive. They tried to analyze what had happened, to find gaps, weaknesses, or flaws in human systems. But the deeper they looked, the more impossible it seemed. Every contingency had been prepared long before their attack, every layer of response perfectly measured. Their arrogance had blinded them to the depth of human planning. Far beyond the station, fleets adjusted their positions subtly, maintaining legal cover, but forming an undeniable presence that surrounded the hostile faction without revealing its full power. Communication channels transmitted warnings, framed as neutral procedural updates. Yet every word carried the weight of consequence. Back inside the corridor, the attackers were isolated, their options shrinking. The environmental adjustments slowed their movements. Their weapons and devices no longer responded with full efficiency. Every misstep recorded and logged, each mistake amplifying their vulnerability. Human legal and diplomatic teams prepared statements that framed the situation perfectly, documenting every act of aggression, every violation, every breach of protocol. These statements were designed not to provoke revenge, but to ensure accountability. The galaxy itself would enforce consequences without the human diplomat lifting a hand. Every species observing, even those far from the station, began to whisper and rethink what they knew about humans. The quiet species they had dismissed as weak had demonstrated something far more formidable. Not just survival, but control over the smallest details of conflict. A patience and precision that could shape outcomes without visible force. The attackers' confidence collapsed under this silent pressure. They realized too late that attacking a human diplomat had activated more than defensive protocols. It had triggered the full capability of a civilization. Every system, every fleet, every legal instrument coordinated in a way that made resistance meaningless. Inside the station, the human diplomat walked calmly to a side chamber, unaffected by the chaos he had orchestrated silently. He met with automated systems, ensured protocols were functioning, and verified that all data was being securely transmitted to allies. His presence alone maintained order while the attackers tried to comprehend what had happened. As the hours passed, the hostile faction's position weakened further. Economic connections were quietly frozen, political alliances shifted, reputations tarnished by documented evidence of aggression, and no single human action had caused this. It was consequence, structure, and law moving quietly but inexorably. The attackers felt trapped not by fear, but by inevitability. Each option for retreat, negotiation, or appeal was already anticipated, cataloged, and countered. Humanity had transformed the environment into a cage without bars, into a net where every movement fed into the final result. Other species began to see the pattern, the lesson, the strength that humans wielded without weapon or shout. They started to adjust their assumptions, reevaluate past encounters, and understand that patience and preparation could turn the weakest appearing diplomat into an unstoppable force. The human diplomat did not celebrate, did not gloat, and did not act arrogantly. He remained calm, quiet, and deliberate. The systems had done the work. His presence had simply guided them. And that was enough. For him, the mission was not about proving power, but ensuring survival and enforcing order. By the end of this phase, the attackers were no longer aggressors with potential leverage. They were a case study in failure, in underestimating patience, in misreading calm as weakness. And the galaxy began to take note, spreading quietly the understanding that humanity could be unstoppable, even without raising a hand. The realization spread slowly, like a ripple through water, that humans did not need violence to assert dominance. Their discipline, preparation, and procedural mastery had done everything. And for the attackers, this quiet form of punishment, this structural inevitability, was far more terrifying than any attack they could have imagined. Even after the incident, the lesson remained. Humanity had not sought revenge, had not escalated emotionally, and yet the consequences were complete, absolute, and unavoidable. And the attackers, along with anyone watching, would never forget that patience and planning were humanity's deadliest weapons. The galaxy began to notice the aftermath of the attack almost immediately. Intelligence networks, political channels, and trade alliances all received detailed reports, meticulously compiled by human diplomats and automated systems. Every move of the hostile faction had been documented, every misstep recorded, and the consequences began to unfold quietly. But inevitably, the attackers found themselves isolated. Allies who might have supported them hesitated, afraid of the evidence that humans had collected. Treaties and agreements that once offered protection were rendered irrelevant by the undeniable facts of aggression. The galaxy began to judge them not on intention, but on action, and their position crumbled. Across multiple star systems, observers shared information, comparing logs, transmissions, and sensor data. Humanity's careful recording and strategic patience left no room for debate. It was clear that the faction had acted aggressively and without understanding the power behind a human diplomat. Some species who had once dismissed humanity as weak began to reconsider their assumptions. Council delegates whispered about the quiet efficiency, the calm restraint, and the ability to enforce consequences without open conflict. Stories spread of a species that could win not through brute force, but through precision, planning, and absolute control. The attackers tried to argue their way out, claiming misunderstanding, claiming accident, claiming provocation. But every claim had been anticipated, logged, and countered. The evidence was unassailable. Each explanation only reinforced the narrative that they had miscalculated, underestimated, and overreached. Humanity's influence moved like water through cracks, not with violence, but with subtle pressure, economic sanctions, political isolation, and diplomatic maneuvering. No ships fired, no weapons deployed, and yet the attackers' options vanished, replaced by a network of constraints they could not ignore. The human diplomat remained removed from the process in person. His presence on the station alone had been enough to trigger the response. But teams of human agents coordinated across multiple systems, ensuring the galaxy understood the consequences and that the attackers were left with no safe options. The hostile faction realized that their reputation was now permanently tarnished. Their ability to negotiate, to influence, and to lead had been undermined, and it had happened without a battle, without bloodshed, merely through the careful and patient application of human procedure, intelligence, and foresight. Other species began to study humans more carefully, learning from this incident, adjusting their own strategies, realizing that patience and planning could outweigh brute strength, and that humanity's willingness to act decisively, yet quietly, made them a power far more formidable than appearances suggested. The galaxy slowly reached a consensus, a quiet acknowledgement forming that humans could enforce law, order, and consequence across vast distances, that a single diplomat was not just a representative, but a center of a vast network of control, capable of influencing events far beyond what anyone had imagined. The attackers were now completely isolated. Their political allies withdrew, their economic partners paused dealings, their communications scrutinized, and even species who had once remained neutral began to avoid contact. The simple act of targeting a human diplomat had caused irreversible damage. The realization settled heavily over the hostile faction. They understood that humans did not seek revenge in the traditional sense, but they enforced balance, and balance was absolute. In the aftermath, every decision made by the attackers was now constrained by the consequences humanity had already set in motion. Stories began circulating across the galaxy of how a human diplomat, calm and unarmed, had triggered systems that dismantled a hostile faction without firing a single shot. These stories emphasized restraint, patience, and precision, showing that humanity's true power lay in preparation and discipline rather than sheer violence. By the end of the process, the attackers faced a future of limitation, scrutiny, and strategic vulnerability. And the galaxy learned a vital lesson. Attacking a human diplomat was not just dangerous, it was a miscalculation that invited consequences measured not by emotion, but by design, patience, and structural inevitability. The ripple effect continued, and even those who had not witnessed the event directly began to adjust their behavior, their policies, their assumptions, realizing that humans had turned silence and calm into the most efficient weapons imaginable, and that every interaction with them required careful respect and calculation. In this quiet but complete victory, humanity's reputation shifted from underestimated species to feared and respected power. The galaxy now knew that patience, planning, and procedure could be far more decisive than aggression, and the attackers had become the ultimate example of misjudgment and consequence. The galaxy slowly absorbed the lesson, and the story of the human diplomat became legend, whispered in council halls, repeated in classrooms, and discussed in private chambers. The phrase, "never attack a human diplomat," began to carry weight far beyond its words, not because humans were physically the strongest, but because they had proven that intelligence, patience, and preparation could turn even a single representative into a force no one could challenge. The attackers had learned the hard way that humans did not act recklessly. They did not need to. Their systems worked silently, invisibly, and irreversibly. Every miscalculation was magnified, every wrong assumption punished, and the galaxy realized that crossing a human diplomat was no longer a minor misstep. It was an invitation to disaster. Other species began to change their policies, shifting alliances, strengthening communication protocols, and observing human actions more closely. Respect mixed with fear, understanding that humanity's calm exterior hid the ability to enforce consequences across vast distances, sometimes without a single visible act of aggression. The human diplomat himself returned to Earth quietly, having achieved his mission without raising a weapon or speaking loudly. His work was done, but the impact of his presence continued to resonate across systems, reminding everyone that humans measured outcomes, not appearances, and that patience was often more deadly than haste. Stories spread of the attacker's downfall, highlighting how arrogance, underestimation, and impulsive aggression had led them to irreversible consequences. Other species studied these accounts, learning that humans could transform silence into strategy, calm into control, and restraint into absolute power. Galactic councils began to treat Earth differently, recognizing that diplomacy with humans required more than politeness or intimidation. It required respect, foresight, and careful calculation. Every interaction became measured, every statement analyzed, because the precedent had been set. Humans would act decisively when necessary, and the results were precise and unavoidable. The attackers were left isolated and humbled, their reputation ruined, alliances broken, and economic connections strained. They had underestimated the quiet species and now faced a future constrained by every misstep they had made. The galaxy watched quietly, learning, taking notes, adjusting behavior to avoid repeating the same mistakes. The human diplomat never claimed victory, never celebrated, and never gloatingly addressed his foes. His approach was subtle but permanent. A quiet demonstration that preparation, law, and patience could enforce consequences more effectively than rage or force, and that a single diplomat could embody the full capability of a civilization. The galaxy internalized the proverb that began to circulate among stars. Never mistake human patience for weakness. Never confuse silence with surrender. Never attack a human diplomat. It became a guiding principle, a warning, a lesson in humility for those who had once thought themselves untouchable. Even years later, ambassadors and negotiators from various species referred to the incident as a turning point, a moment when humanity proved that intellect, strategy, and patience could dominate situations that seemed hopeless or dangerous. It reshaped how the galaxy approached diplomacy, conflict, and trust. The attackers became a cautionary tale, their experience a reminder that arrogance and underestimation could be fatal, and every diplomat, scholar, and strategist from other species carried the story as a lesson in respect, observation, and understanding. Humanity's reputation evolved from underestimated to formidable, not through conquest or war, but through the disciplined execution of procedure and restraint. The diplomat's calm had been the visible tip of a vast, invisible structure capable of enforcing balance. And the galaxy never forgot it. The ripple effects extended beyond politics into culture, art, literature, and philosophy. The story inspired discussions about the nature of power, the value of patience, and the effectiveness of quiet strategy. Humans became a symbol of careful calculation, disciplined response, and unshakable control. At the end, the lesson was simple but profound. Attacking a human diplomat was more than foolish. It was suicidal, not because humans sought revenge, but because consequences had already been silently and meticulously set in motion, and they would arrive without fail. The galaxy finally understood that humans wielded a form of strength that did not need to be seen to be deadly, that calmness could be more powerful than fury, and that patience, paired with preparation, could change the outcome of events in ways no one anticipated. Even generations later, diplomats would cite the incident when negotiating, teaching new ambassadors the importance of respect and foresight. And the words echoed across systems as both warning and wisdom. Humans may appear quiet, unarmed, and alone, but they are never defenseless, and death in its quietest form often waits where humans stand.